And together with a colleague of mine at Oxford, Simon Chesterman, I wrote a piece that we proceeded a decision to intervene in Kosovo. And if you go back and do a media analysis, you will find that there was a complete absence of published criticism of NATO's action for about the first 4 or 5 weeks. Eventually, we found a venue for our piece. It was published under the title, "Has U.S. Power Destroyed the UN?" It was published in the London Review of Books. But it's important here to note that in those first few weeks when British and other pilots were in the air risking their lives, and a very articulate Prime Minister was making the political case for the intervention, Tony Blair, that even the British media, very rigorous, very competitive media, was not going to in any way distance itself from the flag. Mr. Bush proceeded to take up a foreign policy that was considerably more unilateral and belligerent than his predecessor, who was no dove. But Mr. Bush had a substantially different view of international affairs. And, well, I'm pleased to say that I was one of the first people to actually take Mr. Bush on as a freelance journalist, although it was actually pretty tough to get published in the United States. So I published in Britain. I published in The Independent in London, a piece a month after Bush became president entitled, and I didn't choose the title, editors always choose the title, "Is Bush a Threat to the World?" As we know, Mr. Bush, together with Mr. Blair, began a almost inexorable march towards an intervention in Iraq that was interrupted and then perhaps facilitated by the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. And I was critical of that. And of course, in the fall of 2001, the United States, and it was almost entirely a U.S. mission initially, intervened in Afghanistan to remove the Taliban government, the supporters and endorsers of the terrorist acts of al-Qaeda. I supported the intervention in Afghanistan. I opposed Kosovo, I opposed Iraq. I supported the intervention in Afghanistan initially because I thought it was unacceptable that a government that publicly endorsed the murder of almost 3,000 people endorsed it as an act of al-Qaeda and not as an act of anyone else, be allowed to remain in power and to harbor that organization. I did, however, become very critical very early of the treatment of detainees. I wrote a piece in January of 2002 in The Guardian that was entitled, "Donald Rumsfeld does not have the right to decide who is and is not a POW." And I can tell you, I was pillared back in the United States for my writing. The Guardian, The Independent published online, open access. My pieces were picked up by websites such as freerepublic.com. I was hung out to dry by Bill O'Reilly on the O'Reilly Factor, although he didn't invite me in to defend myself. And I was, well, let's just say, received a lot of very, very angry and threatening emails for my writing about the treatment of detainees, about Bush's foreign policy, about the march towards Iraq in defiance of the will of the international community, and essentially the ongoing systematic mistreatment and torture of detainees. So I've seen it elsewhere. I've seen the media. I've seen how the media is put in difficult positions. How good, well-meaning, hard-working journalists find themselves constrained. One important factor that I can see in the way that the Canadian media responds to a war like the one in Afghanistan concerns the fact that there's a fairly cohesive, well-organized, well-funded defense lobby in this country that did not grow up around the intervention in Afghanistan. It grew up in response to the very severe military budget cutbacks of the 1990s, led by, well, Paul Martin as Jean Chrétien's finance minister, the so-called peace dividend that we could slash our military budgets by 20 or 30% because the Cold War was over. So we could fly, or allow our pilots to fly, Sea King helicopters that were older, substantially older than their pilots. We could send troops on peacekeeping missions with uniforms that were worn through at the knee. I mean, we did seriously underfund our military through the 1990s, and in response to this, people like Jack Granatstein and David Berkeson decided to get organized, to form a cohesive group that would make the public case for a stronger, better funded military. They had some serious support from the military itself. Obviously, the generals liked the idea of someone lobbying to give them more money. The generals, the civilian administrators at the Department of National Defense created something called the Security and Defense Forum that now spreads $10 million a year around sympathetic academics, university institutes across the country. Most of the time when you see a university academic popping up speaking in favor of the intervention in Afghanistan or new C-17s for the military or just about anything else that the military has done, there's someone who receives a couple $100,000 a year in program money from the Department of National Defense. In Canada, that's a lot of money for an academic to spend on conferences, on travel, on research assistance. And the Center for International Studies at UBC is one of the recipients. I have refused to go on their list of associated academics to maintain some independence, but there you have it. These academics and friends outside of academia also form something called the Canadian Defence and Foreign Affairs Institute, which itself receives funding from the Department of National Defence. And they have a concerted, organized program of writing op-eds and submitting them to national newspapers. They even have someone who's paid full-time to write op-eds, based in Calgary. And some journalists, well, have gotten rather close to the Canadian Defence and Foreign Affairs Institute. Natasha Hassan, who's the deputy comment editor of the Globe and Mail and used to be the comment editor for the National Post, is proudly listed as an associate member of the Canadian Defence and Foreign Affairs Institute. Now, all this was done to increase funding for the military. I think noble cause, particularly if you're trying to send Canadian soldiers on peacekeeping missions into dangerous places to do good things. I have no real problem with people organizing to lobby for the military and the military helping them out. And $10 million compared to what I saw in the UK or the United States is really small potatoes. And then along comes Afghanistan. And Afghanistan becomes a justification for more money for the military. Well, we need to have Chinook helicopters to move our soldiers around because we're relying on the Dutch and the Americans and the British for this. You know, we need new howitzers to defend our soldiers. We need more soldiers. And Rick Hillier, to his credit, very effective in terms of lobbying within the bureaucracy in Ottawa and also lobbying within the public space and the media and elsewhere, has seized upon Afghanistan as the principal justification for a larger, much better funded Canadian forces.